Hello, Happy New Year. How are you all? Before we start, I'd like to ask for blessing from our Lord. First of all, I pray that the Lord will accept our gratitude for giving us another new year. And we thank Him for our health, our family, and our friends. And we ask Him in this new beginning to release us from our burdens of sin and worries, and teach us to look away from ourselves and to behold Him. May He grant us a year filled with peace, joy, and love, and that He will continue to protect us and our family. Well, new year, new book to study, and this time we're going to start the book of Exodus. Well, Exodus gets its name from two Greek words that means out and way. It literally means way out or departure. The title Exodus captures the content of the book very well, especially its first half. It is a story of the children of Israel's departure from Egypt, where they have been enslaved. Exodus is an important period of time in the history of Israel. And when was the Exodus? The Bible didn't give any information concerning the date. It is difficult to date the Exodus because, according to archaeologists, it could be around 1290 BC. But then, when the scholar used the biblical figures and working backwards, starting from the date of Solomon's death, it arrived at 1440 BC. And some critics believe that the event of Exodus had never occurred because there's an absence of evidence. But we Christians know that absence of evidence does not necessarily indicate evidence of absence, because in the past we learned that historians were not always right. For example, critics thought the Hittites didn't exist, but were shown to be wrong once archaeological evidence for the existence of this people group was eventually found. In this instant, perhaps the archaeologists were looking at the wrong period of time. Now, let's turn our eyes toward chapter 1 of Exodus. The beginning of Exodus is closely linked with the ending of Genesis. In Joseph's dying words, he begged his brothers to believe that God would one day bring them out of Egypt. This is what Joseph said in the last chapter of Genesis. He said, "I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land He promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Joseph has strong faith in God's promise. The promise was given to his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father. And he himself had witnessed God's saving power and deliverance. At this point, I'd like to ask us, how about us? Do we still have the faith of our parents, grandparents, if we are the second or third, even fourth generation Christian? And if we are the first generation Christian, we may ask, have I experienced God in such a way that I can tell my children of God's saving grace? The first chapter of Exodus sets the background. It is to let you know the crisis happening in Egypt to the descendants of Jacob. Let me read to you. Verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. Verse 1 to 7 reminds us of what happened to Abraham's family in Genesis. The first few verses are the names of the sons of Jacob who went to Egypt. And each son went with his family. The first 5 verses were repeating Genesis chapter 46, verse 8. It is to remind us that Exodus is the ongoing story of God's work, creating a people who will bring blessings to all nations, as he had promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It is to tell us again that they were meant to be in Egypt temporarily and not to settle permanently there. Their permanent home is in the promised land. It's in Canaan. There's an interesting observation in the first verse. Let me repeat the first verse to you again. It says, "These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob." Why does it use the name Israel as well as Jacob? It's the same person. Why say Israel and Jacob instead of just all Israel or all Jacob, right? Why can't it say, "These are the names of Jacob's sons who came with him to Egypt"? Before I explain, just to jot your memory, Jacob's name was changed by God to Israel at a place called Peniel by the ford Jabbok. What happened there? While Jacob's brother Esau was coming to greet him with 400 men, perhaps for the purpose of get even with what Jacob had done years ago, stealing his birthright. You can look at the story in Genesis chapter 32. And so Jacob was afraid, not only for himself, but also for the safety of his large family. He prayed to God to bless him with protection. Up until this point, Jacob had been a self-reliant man. He depends on his own wits for success. But now his survival and his family's survival were dependent on his brother's forgiveness. And Jacob had no control over his brother's heart. Therefore he prayed. He knew there was one who has control over everyone and everything. So he asked God to bless him with protection. And when he was crossing the ford Jabbok, an angel, actually it's God himself, came to wrestle with him. Although Jacob was prevailing, but when God touched his hip, it became dislocated. Jacob knew at that moment that he was wrestling with God. So he held on to the angel who was God. He wouldn't let him go until he blessed him. It was there that Jacob surrendered himself to God, and God changed his name from Jacob to Israel. Literally means God rules. His names Jacob and Israel are being used in this verse is to help us recall his struggle in becoming Israel. So then, what does it have to do with the story Exodus? Well, the name of Jacob is used here to reflect his striving, his struggle with God and with humans. But then he prevailed. And then it used the name Israel, meaning at the end, God rules. This indicates there's an ongoing nature of the struggle of a people who are Jacob's descendants to becoming the family in which God rules. Throughout the book of Exodus, we'll see the struggle between self-reliance, refusing to surrender, and letting God lead. And the passage also had a list, the list of Jacob's sons, but they are not by birth order. It is in the same order as recorded in Genesis chapter 35. The author listed Leah's sons first and then Rachel's. Afterward, Rachel's maid and then Leah's maid. The passage reiterates the number 70 as he had done so in Genesis chapter 46, the total number of Jacob's family that sojourned to Egypt. But we know that 70 is not the exact number of Jacob's family because Joseph was already in Egypt, right? And we mentioned previously also that 70 denotes completeness. The passage also mentioned that Israel's family grew in number, meaning their women were fertile and they were raising large and strong families. The families were everywhere, fulfilling the promise God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that their descendants would be as numerous as the stars and as the sands of the sea. Now let's move on to verse 8 of Exodus chapter 1. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. A new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. Meaning Joseph's good reputation was forgotten. Or perhaps he really didn't care about what Joseph had done for Egypt. Joseph lived until he was 110 years old, and the Israelites were in Egypt for 430 years. But we really don't know the exact time when the Pharaoh began to oppress the people of God. Let's read verse 9. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land. The population of the Israelites were big in number, and the Pharaoh's main concern was the Israelites would leave the country or they would join the enemy if war breaks out. He said, let us deal shrewdly with them, meaning to deal wisely with them. The Pharaoh's worry was in opposite to God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You notice that? God promised that Abraham's descendants would become a nation. They would be as numerous as a star or the sands of the sea. And God would give them the land of Canaan. But Pharaoh's worry was that Israel would become too numerous, and they would either leave Egypt or would join their enemy. If they leave Egypt, Egypt's economy probably would suffer. If they join the enemy may win the war if war breaks out. So the Pharaoh wanted to deal shrewdly with the Israelites. Verse 11. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. They built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. The Pharaoh set up Egyptian captains in charge over the Israelite laborers. They oversaw the building of the northern and northeastern border town, Pithom and Ramses, that serve as Egyptian military supply cities. It is for the purpose of protection and campaigns. And these taskmasters afflict the Israelites with heavy burdens, meaning the Israelite laborer were cruelly treated, perhaps even with violence. Verse 12. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves and made their life bitter with hard service in mortar and brick, and in all kinds of work in the field. In all the work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. Even with cruel and violent treatment, the Israelites continued to multiply and grow. In a sense, Egypt served as a mother's womb for Israel, a place where they rapidly grow from a large clan to a mighty nation. Well, this frightened the Egyptians and they loathed the Israelites. But what could they do? Well, they responded with even more vigorous brutality, having them make mortar and bricks in all kinds of work to support their large-scale building project. Now, the following verses will show us that Pharaoh is not in control, and God is in control. Verse 15. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this, and let the male children live? Despite their harsh treatment, the Israelites continued to increase numerically. The Egyptian king embarks on a form of ethnic cleansing as he commands the midwives to murder at birth all male Hebrew children. There's a stark contrast here. The Hebrew midwives who are fearless and refuse to obey Pharaoh. They are courageous because they fear the Lord. Contrasting to the fearful, paranoid Pharaoh who does not believe in God. The disobedience of the midwife is striking because the king, Pharaoh, who is viewed as a deity, has absolute power. By disobeying the king, the women risk their own lives. The women are called the Hebrews. It is a title associated with Abraham. You can look that up in Genesis 14, verse 13. And Hebrew is also used by other nationalities to call the descendants of Jacob. You can look that up in Genesis chapter 39, verse 14 and verse 17. And also pay attention to the first few chapters of Exodus of how the Hebrew women play the key role in the deliverance of Israel from their crisis. The following verses is how the midwives reply Pharaoh of why they didn't kill the male babies of the Hebrews. Verse 19. The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Shiphrah and Puah, who were probably the chief Hebrew midwives. They probably supervised the Jewish mothers as they deliver the babies on the birth stools. And that's the reason that Pharaoh ordered them to kill the male babies. But they did not. They excused their inaction by explaining that the Hebrew children were usually born too quickly. That is before the midwives could get to the mothers. The midwives had respect for life, as God wanted them to have. Even though they lied to Pharaoh, they are praised for their outright refusal to take infant lives. Their reverence for life reflects a reverence for God. Thus God blessed them and gave them families. verse 22. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live." Pharaoh's plan was foiled by the Hebrew midwives. These women refused to commit infanticide. So now Pharaoh commanded all his people to help him in committing this horrendous crime. In summary, what have we learned from this chapter? First of all, we must recognize that Exodus is a continuation of the book of Genesis. There are a couple of things that I learned from here. Number one, God moves his plan forward through the past. What does that mean? That means we must not disregard the past. Just like the descendants of Jacob, they must remember God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and how God had provided for them when there was famine. And in remembering the past, we'll be encouraged when hardship strikes us. Also, although we are not to forget the past, but we must not get stuck in the past, because the past is a guidepost to the future. God continues to move his plan forward until its fulfillment. Number two, God moves his plan forward through our obedience. Just like the Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, in the midst of difficulties, it would have been easier for them to compromise. It would have been safer for them to appease Pharaoh, but they didn't. It would be wrong. So, what is right during a difficult time like this? The narrative teaches us that we need to have steadfast obedience to God, to do what is right according to his teachings, no matter what the circumstances is. Happy Sabbath and Happy New Year.